Hi, welcome. I'm Hannah. This is Theology Therapist. Last week we talked about the prevalence of purity pledges in evangelical culture. And this week I want to take a minute and look at what the effects of that movement was on the people who were in it. So the biggest impact of purity culture is by and large how it has created an environment of shame about sex and sexuality. Within purity culture, sort of the three tenets are the saying, modest is hottest, virginity itself is very important, and abstinence, right? So abstinence also is like such a sex education. These were and they all sort of sound like different sides of the same coin. They form the basis of purity culture. And so when virginity is held up as the most important thing, when abstinence is the only sex education that's taught, and when modest is hottest, what that creates, what you get is this culture, this environment about sex and sexuality and bodies that is so full of shame because the undertones are about like badness, right? Our bodies or anything related to sex is bad, right? And so then we grow up kind of unknowingly with this dichotomy, with these two different binaries, these two different things in our mind. Like it is either bad or it is either good, right? And there's only a few circumstances in which it's good. So I want to just jump right in and talk a little bit about. So I also want to say that like each of these points that I'm going to talk about today, I think could be a larger conversation in and of itself, and it might be soon here. But today I just want to kind of dip our toes into the water and see from you as well if you've had any experiences with these or if these parts of purity culture have impacted you. So let's get started. All right, so if you research in Google or you type into Google purity culture, you're going to come up with pages upon pages on pages of results full of blogs, of research articles, of like Amazon buys, of YouTube videos, right? Like, and a whole lot more. There is a ton of stuff about purity culture. And I would say that actually in my recent research, in prepping for last week and this week, my research has shown that like the top pages about purity culture, they are responses to it. They are negative. They're not the kind of promotion anymore, right? And by and large, what these pages and pages on Google are talking about are the aspects of shame and like the drastic impact that purity culture had on really like a generation. Because remember, it was most prominent in like at the beginning of like the 90s into the early 2000s. So I found this one statistic from this research article I want to share it with you because I think that it's just really kind of speaks to probably some of our experiences. So there is a magazine, Sojourners. It's online. The origin of the magazine is religious in nature. I do believe it either is or used to be Christian or had a Christian or evangelical background, and whether or not that's still the case, I didn't dig into that. But I did find this article from Sojourners, and they were quoting this research article. So there is a research database, it's called PRRI, and the researchers, Daniel Cox and Robert Jones, they researched the changing religious identity in the US. This research article was quoted in the Sojourners article about purity culture. And so I'm going to take that quote from there. I've read the research article, the original research article itself. It's super fascinating. I'm going to link it here in case you're interested because it talks a lot about how the religious landscape in America is changing. So here's the quote. Some credit the negative reactions to purity culture as fueling the exodus of young adults from the evangelical church. In 2006, white evangelicals comprised 23% of Americans, and that number dropped to 17% by 2016. So first, that's a huge drop in a short amount of time. For the group that had been the dominant group, I would say in America, especially from what I read from that original PRI article, that it had been the dominant group and it is rapidly declining. There are probably lots of other things there are other factors that weigh into someone's decision to whether to leave church or faith or not. But I think that it is accurate to say that some credit can be given to negative reactions from purity culture on this huge swath of a generation, because that's the age group that is now coming up as what's called religious nuns, so N-O-N-E-S. So I don't know if you've ever heard of this term before, but the category of religious nuns is the most rapidly increasing sort of religious, if you will, affiliation in the US. And I think it includes atheist, agnostic, and non-affiliated. So I know you're gonna hear that and be like, it's not religious affiliation. Even if you identify that, you're probably gonna I'm just telling you that's in the religious surveys. That's how it's grouped. So it's not me saying that, but that's in the survey research statistics, that's how and so I find that completely fascinating. I find it really quite moving. It speaks quite strongly to me about how much that this sort of ethic of black and white, of good versus bad, how that did not resonate with this whole generation of people, and who are now saying no, I don't buy into it anymore. Okay, so some of the maybe 3 areas that I would say tend to be most impacted afterwards, after kind of coming out of a purity culture. I mean, even while you're in it, but you probably don't know it, are sex practices, a sort of communal commentary, and then sexuality and LGBTQAI inclusion. So first, sex practices, you heard me talk a little bit about this last week. The biggest impact, I would say, on someone's sex practices, someone's sex life, after kind of being indoctrinated with a purity ethic, is that idea of what I was mentioning about good or bad. Sex is either good or bad, and it is bad in every context except for after marriage. And after you get married in a heteronormative, heterosexual relationship, then you're supposed to just have sex all the time and it's going to be amazing. And that is just not the reality, right? Because our brains are not made. They don't actually, they don't go from this is bad in every sort of scenario to this is good in every scenario. We don't make that jump. And so what happens is that even after someone, even if they do kind of keep that purity ethic, if you will, or if they wait until they were married, well, you often find that it's quite hard to have a healthy, positive sex relationship in marriage, because it just feels like what you're doing is wrong, or you feel shamed about having sex with your husband or with your wife, or because remember, that's the narrative. That's what's acceptable. And so there are whole, especially in this blog world, there are whole huge amounts of people who have written blogs and books and documentaries about how this didn't work. And it actually created a lot of problems in their sex lives, even if they kept the purity ethic, even all this stuff, because it created so much shame. And so when they were deciding to have sex, they, one, were kind of like at the same time kind of trapped in this feeling of this mindset of like, what I'm doing is bad, and so I'm bad, and like this is like, I should be ashamed of myself. Like this whole thing that we're doing here, there's this aspect of disgust, right? So this is like disgusting. And that's really strong languaging, right? That's really strong languaging, and those are really strong like emotions. Shame, disgust, kind of badness, the emotions that evokes. Those are really kind of core things. And so that's why that's like the first point into how purity culture kind of really severely messes with our ability to have a sex positive or a positive sexual experience or relationship. The other thing about sex practices that I mentioned before is that whenever you are in a purity culture environment, what is taught, the sex education that is taught, is abstinence only. And so in abstinence only sex education, which I will add from all this research that I've recently done, just as like updating what I already know about this, is that it's still the federally funded sex education in schools. So abstinence only sex education is still being federally funded, which is crazy. So when the sex education is abstinence only, because within abstinence only education, there's no like option, if you will, for someone to have sex. It's like you can't, you don't, right? Unless you're within the confines of marriage. And so if you're in the confines of marriage, you don't need a condom, you don't need like contraception, you don't have to worry about STIs, you don't like X, Y, and Z. And so they don't talk about any of that. And so when you're a teen, when you're an adolescent, and you don't learn any of that, you don't learn about condoms, you don't learn about contraception, you don't learn about STIs or safe sex practices, and you don't learn about consent, right? Then you're set up for a really tough situation. So what tends to happen is that because teens who grow up under abstinence-only sex education, they don't get education about condoms or contraception. And if you remember, virginity is key here. Virginity is thought of as penetration, intercourse. What they tend to do is they choose other sex practices, right? So they choose like maybe oral sex or anal sex and kind of like these types of behaviors. And they're not opting for contraception or safe sex practices. And so, because, let me put this in a context, the narrative is shame. This is why teens choose to do something, like to opt for one thing and not another, right? It's not about like wanting to do one of these other things. It's about, we can't do this. And so I'm going to choose X, Y, or Z, which may or may not be good for me in this moment, or may or may not be safe for me in this moment. The other thing, and this leads right into this second area that purity culture impacts, is communal commentary. So as we talked about before, if you've done like a whole true love weight ceremony, if you have a purity ring, there is this like really sort of weird communal commentary on your sex life. And so whenever or if ever somebody decides to take off that ring, like think teenagers here, it becomes this like community conversation about like, oh, why did you do that? Or like, oh, or like, do we need to talk about something? And so it makes somebody's sex life kind of front and center. It makes it like sort of available for everybody else to have thoughts and opinions about. And those thoughts and opinions tend to not be positive, right? And so that is how the thing about those teens who are deciding whether or not to like engage in like normal sex practices or whatever, or like make decisions for themselves about how they might like to be having sex, they also have this communal commentary overlaid of, well, like my sex life is actually not mine. It's like for everybody else. It's everybody else has thoughts and opinions about my sex life, right? And so in order to avoid all that negative backlash, I need to like keep this on lock to like kind of maintain control here. Or I need to be doing other things, but I need to not do that thing, right? Okay, so like that's kind of how that all plays out. Lastly, or that third point that I would talk about today is how it impacts sexuality and LGBTQ persons within these groups. Sexuality. So what happens in purity culture, what we know is there's so much shame, and sex is either good or bad, and it's most of the time bad. And so what can happen a lot of times is that whenever someone's choosing to have sex, whether or not it's in a moment that would be classified by the community as good or bad, there's been such a narrative of shame around sex that sexual dysfunction is more prevalent, and like sexual performance anxiety is a lot more prevalent, because there's just like way more pressure, right? It's not like we're just having sex, or I'm having sex. It's like there's so much, there's like divine pressure here. There is like sort of after life consequences. And so there can be sexual dysfunction or sexual performance anxiety. It also, like, just think that, like, if we're talking about here about the narrative for heterosexual relationships, because that's the one that's recognized in this community, just think that if you're a teen and you don't identify as straight, like what this kind of narrative does to you, how it impacts you. I mean, it has huge implications. So aside from being really isolating, we've talked about shame, and that's still the case, but it's like even more, because at some point in the narrative, there is some talk about how sex is good, right? Within the confines of marriage between a man and a woman. And if that's never gonna be you, like marriage between a man and a woman, or like marriage, or like maybe you're poly, maybe you're trans, like maybe you're gay and you're just like this, if this is only okay, then I'm doomed. That is really the impact of this. It's so damaging, especially to LGBT teens, because they're not only not given, along with everyone else, a proper sex education, but they're not even given a place at the table. Remember, if we talked about, like we talked about in the beginning, we are so good at deconstructing something, at tearing it down. And with religion, that might happen dramatically, or it might just happen like passively, if you will. It might just happen where you leave or you stop going, or what we're left with is this kind of, when we deconstruct, we're left with this sort of vacuum. We need to fill up that space with a new theology, if that's your thing, or a new ethic. And so what we actually need after purity culture is a new ethic of sexuality, or a new theology of sexuality. I would love to hear from you guys. If you have experienced a good ethic or theology of sexuality, feel free to leave it in the comment. And I hope that this creates a space, or you find a space here for knowing that you were or are not alone, that there are lots and lots of other people who have experienced the effects of purity culture or purity ethic. And this isn't, I think before we were talking last week about in the evangelical church, but I think even this week I think this applies even more broadly to other religious communities, other religious groups, to specifically a purity ethic, a purity culture where purity is the ideal, and how this impacts someone's sense of self, identity, and safe sex practices. So if you haven't subscribed yet, click that red button so you can stay up to date on all weekly content, and leave a comment below so I know that you're here and what you want to hear more about. Be well.